There we go. So we're recording now. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to QuantSpark's webinar on generative AI and business. We'll start shortly. We'll just wait a few moments for others to join. Good afternoon. We'll start shortly. We'll just wait a few moments for others to join the webinar. Wonderful. Let's start. Well, it's great to see everyone on this webinar. We'll be talking about unlocking the potential of generative AI in business and sharing our perspective at QuantSpark. We should have a good 10 minutes or so at the end for any questions. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat in the meantime, and we'll come around to any questions later on in the presentation. So thanks a lot for everyone's time today. Let's begin. Luke, if you could start the presentation. Thank you. So at QuantSpark, we focus on driving transformation through analytics and AI. Fundamentally, what we focus on is understanding and identifying high-value complex processes where data technologies can be applied profitably. And we do so by combining the best of industry-specific operational insight with the data science techniques and approaches with software development. And we aim to combine all of these as an end-to-end proposition, because we believe that developing software or developing data science solutions is only important if it's focusing on the right things within the business. And through this presentation, what we want to go through is our ideas about the role that generative AI can play in business transformation, but also crucially, the elements of analytics that need to be done first sometimes. So we take businesses on an end-to-end transformation journey. And the key part of this is the mindset of the stakeholders in the business, potentially the investors as well. It's important, of course, that we are focused on the opportunities surrounding AI and generative AI. At QuantSpark, it's really only recently that we've discussed AI or mentioned it. And the historic reason for that is that AI typically is used to describe statistics or machine learning or deep learning, which are all laudable disciplines, but often require a huge amount of preparation and enablement work to be useful and effective. What we find is the mindset is absolutely crucial. So that's the growth mindset, typically, in working with a management team that understands that a lot of this is on one hand experimental, and the other hand, it's kind of pretty obvious transformation work that needs to be done. But the mindset of the company and the environment within that company has to be in the right place for this type of transformation work to be effective. Secondly, we need to be working towards an agreed strategy. So the business has to already have in mind its own growth plan, its own growth strategy, and ideally having identified high-value complex processes itself. When this is in place, when the mindset is there and the strategy is in place, then it's important to focus on actually doing things. Often there's a perception that analytics work might take years to deploy. In many cases, it's possible to get tangible results within a couple of weeks. And that's what we try to focus on here is saying, well, provided the mindset of the business is there and there's a clear direction, it's possible to achieve results within, let's say, 3 to 4 weeks, and to use a proof of concept tool or approach to build further interest in a particular analytics idea. So moving on from that introduction, one question we often start with, especially where generative AI is concerned is this question. Imagine you have 10 intelligent, well-educated graduates from top universities, and they're going to be working for you for free 24/7 hours a day. What would you do with them? And this is quite a profound question, because often the answer is, we don't really know. And I wonder whether there's anyone in the audience who would like to propose an answer to this. I won't pick on anyone, but if anyone has any thoughts, please do pop your hand up, and be very interested to hear your perspective. So there are no takers. What I will say is that this is often the starting question that we use when we're working with a client to help them understand where generative AI can be put in place. Because it's no exaggeration to say that generative AI, in many senses, is equivalent to a well-educated graduate. When we're able to focus the large language model on a very specific, well-defined problem, many benchmarks show that these tools can outperform well-educated human beings. So the question we have here is, what would you do with a team of 10 graduates from a top university? Is not a theoretical one, it's actually a practical one. And hopefully this will start to kind of share our philosophy about how to approach generative AI. In our view, it's not really about the technology. It's not about AI. It's actually about how we conceptualize our own organizations and how we link the strategy that we're designing with the core processes and activities that we have in a business. So moving on from this, when thinking through generative AI, we share this idea. So the first is that there are several waves, in fact, 3 waves of disruption from generative AI. Personally, I use generative AI tools, large language model tools, for probably 3 hours a day. So the single biggest chunk of my personal time is using the likes of ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, and many other tools that use generative AI to augment existing processes and workflows. So in my individual case, this means writing proposals, summarizing meetings, responding to emails, and that sort of kind of typically summarization use case. And I would encourage all of us to to embrace these technologies as much as our IT team will allow. Often there are some, I suppose, apprehensions about the security of many of these systems. And some of these are justified, most aren't. There are always trade-offs in terms of what security considerations we might be making and what the potential productivity gains are. So the first wave of transformation here is actually our own individual workflows. And obviously, document writing, email production and response is one of the first ones, but there are many others as well. The second element of this is that organizational transformation wave. So thinking through how AI-based innovation can be applied for the software that we're building, or applied to improve the productivity of key processes in our business. And then the third wave is clearly across an entire industry. So once we've managed to scope out a high-value complex problem that can benefit from automation or augmentation using generative AI, how could this potentially be scaled to disrupt an entire industry? But of course, all of this starts with us as individuals. So moving to the next slide, the typical analytics pyramid is the one we have on the slide here. And the base of this slide is data architecture and infrastructure. Quite frankly, it's often really boring, very hard to get buy-in, quite expensive, quite complicated. Traditionally, of course, in order to reach the apex of this pyramid, let's say the optimization that might come from deploying machine learning or statistical techniques, you'd need to go through all of the other layers in this pyramid. Now, this is the case still, often, but not necessarily always the path that we have to follow, given that generative AI can automate and augment a lot of the key processes at the bottom there. So there's a kind of duality here, which is generative AI is providing quite a few opportunities to leapfrog some of the bottlenecks that have been in place in terms of transformation through analytics and AI. But at the same time, there are always going to be some dependencies. You're always going to need data. You're always going to need to understand your business. and be directing the activity of the people in your business efficiently. So moving on from this, what is generative AI and how can it be used in business and indeed in public sector organizations? So artificial intelligence, the definition of this focuses on this concept of cognitive functions. Now, before large language models, this was largely a kind of fairly niche activity, mainly focused on kind of mathematical applications. But of course, with generative AI and the transformed technology that's behind that, things have changed quite significantly. So actually talking about cognitive functions now is kind of obvious. Most mainstream chatbots that we're familiar with, ChatGPT or Claude, Mistral and others, are pretty convincing in terms of emulating cognitive functions. And of course, there's quite a lot of philosophical debate about this. There's the Turing test that you might have heard of, which was an early test devised by Alan Turing, supposedly to help determine whether a machine had reached a conscious state. And the idea was that if you could chat with a machine and not figure out whether it's a human or not, then by definition, it would be cognitive. I think we passed that hurdle a few years ago with GPT-3. So clicking through the slide then, there are a number of components to this. So generative AI is particularly focused on pattern creation on the right here. So this is moving things forward from traditional AI, which is on the left of this slide in the sort of turquoise blue color. So traditional AI would focus on pattern recognition, categorization, whereas generative AI is more about creating content, of course, but also providing a much more powerful capability to understand information. And I use understand advisedly. By understand, I mean identifying patterns from unstructured data. That's to say, images, documents, PDFs, videos, and audio. So there are different deployments of what's called multimodal large language models that vastly increase the amount of data that can be analyzed by AI. Moving on from this, thinking about the pyramid that we shared a few moments ago, what's clear is that generative AI can augment all of these processes and all of these activities. So remember the point I was making just now about the bottom layer there, data architecture and infrastructure. So you need databases, you've got to connect them together, you've got to compare and contrast data and make sure it's valid and it's reconciled, all these things that I'm sure we're familiar with, that historically would take a very long time to do. Even that layer can be augmented using generative AI. So our view is that generative AI isn't a product, it isn't a discrete solution. It's actually a way of thinking about using AI in an organization and to support activities. And in many cases, generative AI is not just about toy models or chatbots and producing content. It's often about understanding complex data sets and potentially also orchestrating other technologies. So it's possible to use large language models to make decisions about how other technology should be used. And that's what is known as being an agent. And that's where a lot of growth will come from with generative AI. So hopefully this helps to share some of our ideas about what generative AI really is and how it can be effective. It's not a thing in of itself, but actually more a technique to bolster other activities. And this applies to data analytics as much as it does to any other part of business. Moving on from this, we provide this AI framework. So here we've got a quadrant, so it's 4 quadrants, and the vertical axis there is the structure of data. So unstructured, meaning it's data as it appears in the wild, right? So not necessarily organized in any particular way, not necessarily labeled, whereas structured data is often organized, potentially in tables. It might be labeled, it might be ordered in some way that makes it easier to understand. And the horizontal axis here is about complexity. And by complexity, what we mean is a number of processes, sub-processes, dependencies, and overall ambiguity about what that problem is and what it needs to be solved. And we often think of this concept of wicked problems in the context of complexity. So we've got these three buckets here. So top left, top right, bottom right. And our argument is that there are three flavors of where analytics and AI can support organizations. So at the top left is where there's structured and low complexity information. So that's where there's an automation opportunity. So often this is, when we think of robotic process automation, which is a technology that's been around probably since the 1960s, is really good when you have a very simple problem, highly structured data sets. Generative AI can help here, of course. It can help there very easily. The question is whether it would be worth doing that, because often low complexity problems are often not really worth solving. But certainly there's a huge opportunity at the top left there. The top right is when there's high complexity and highly structured information or data. And we call this optimization. And this is typically what you'd expect from advanced AI or machine learning, kind of pre-generative AI. So generative AI can help here, but actually, if you're thinking about optimization, such as churn optimization or marketing analytics optimization, generative AI can help there a little bit, but fundamentally, this is quite a kind of classic problem that other elements of AI can be used for. And the bottom right is where we talk about augmentation. So this is human in a loop activity, where there's a really complex decision, unstructured data, quite a lot of ambiguity. There's arguably much greater opportunity for generative AI in the bottom right there, which is when you want this human in the loop, when you've got a complex workflow, where you want to support people making faster, better decisions, but you don't want to absolve them entirely of responsibility for that decision-making flow. So this provides a bit of a framework for the type of initiatives that we advise on. And crucially, this type of framework helps select the right data technology for the right problem, because generative AI can be powerful, can be useful, but often we need to step back a bit. So moving on to the next slide. How familiar are you with AI? Now we know millions of people are using AI and generative AI. According to Deloitte, 39% of workers in the UK have used generative AI in their work. I wonder how many have done so with the permission of their IT teams, probably quite a small proportion of it. But what we know is that quite a few business leaders and others in business and organizations are unfamiliar with generative AI. And building out these use cases is really quite important to ensure that people are using this technology in a way that's compliant with regulation and data privacy, for example, but also using this in ways that we can learn across an organization and collate best practice to drive improvements across the business. Moving on from this, what are the barriers to adoption? So the first barrier is often lack of awareness, or perhaps less diplomatically, lack of imagination. Pretty much anything we can do digitally can be done by AI now. This wasn't the case a year ago. It can be done with generative AI if you know how to approach a problem, and if you've defined the problem well enough, almost certainly generative AI can help with part of that. The other element of this is trust. So it's not just compliance and concerns about data privacy, but also trust in the outcome and the answers that these models provide. So where possible, we think it's important to step back and to focus on understanding how the business works. What are the opportunities for deploying AI in an imaginative way, but then also thinking through how can we build trust. And the trust element of this is not just about, as I've said, trust in the compliance side of things, but trust in the outcomes and trust in the process of winning people around and building trust and confidence in new technology. Moving on, there are a number of misconceptions about generative AI. And in a sense, there are some extreme parts of the spectrum. So one of them is that generative AI can solve everything. So there's a school of thought that it can solve everything. And some tech billionaires are of the view that generative AI will take over the world, and isn't this terrifying? Now, there is some truth to this. Pretty much anything we can do digitally can be done better than generative AI, provided that we can understand and define the problem well enough, and provided that we can minimize risk of mistakes being made. But there are many precursors and dependencies to this. So the opportunity for generative AI, in many senses, reinforces the need to do the classic analytics work that historically businesses have been so reluctant to invest in. The second misconception is that your data must be perfect before using AI. Now, I suppose it depends what type of AI we're talking about. If we're talking about statistical methods or machine learning, you probably still need to do a huge amount of work to prepare the data. But generative AI can support here by improving your ability to reconcile data, to match data, to link things up in ways that are useful. So there is some way that generative AI can be used to help clean up data sets. Potentially, some deployments of generative AI can predict and optimize, but currently generative AI isn't really focused on optimization problems. It probably will be before long. What we know from what is currently possible is generative AI can build tools, can write scripts, can do machine learning by writing the Python code, for example. So it's a slightly odd way of thinking about it, but generative AI can do a lot of optimization work, but not directly. It has to build programs to do it, which is kind of mind-blowing. The third point here is that generative AI will replace human workers. Now, I think this is a pretty mixed picture. What I would say is if you know how to use generative AI, your own personal productivity can be improved. If you have competitors that are able to use generative AI better than you, they will get competitive advantage. So I don't think this is necessarily about replacing people and replacing companies, but it does reinforce the need to focus on what is strategically unique about what we do as individuals and as companies, and thinking through how we can embrace the generative AI revolution. I would argue that generative AI will potentially remove, let's say, 50% of what we do. What it will increase is the dependence on creativity, on imagination, and relationship building. And in general, generative AI is powerful only when two things are true. Only when you give it a very large amount of data in a prompt, for example, and you provide absolute clarity about the outcome. If you do these two things, it can be extremely powerful. And one misconception about generative AI, I mean, certainly early use case might be, write a poem on something. Well, that's really not going to work. But if you feed generative AI a transcript of a call, let's say a 2-hour call or a webinar, and give it a huge amount of material, and then say, this is the template and these are examples, generative AI typically will be very successful in converting that information into something that's more useful for you. And at QuantSpark, that's typically how we produce our proposals, for example. We will talk to an LLM for a while, we'll brief a generative AI model, we'll give it a template, and then we'll ask it to convert it into a proposal. And it usually gets 95% of the way there in about 10 seconds. So moving on from this, the point we want to stress here is that as a business leader, your job is to understand your own business processes and its strategy, of course. Your job is not to understand the detail of how generative AI can be deployed, and that's sort of fine. The irony actually is that you don't really need to know about generative AI. All you really need to understand is your own business processes, how these can be mapped, and what the opportunities might be. The imagination that you have here really is the main limit, which is a bit of a cliche, but it also happens to be true in the case of generative AI. So moving on from this to the final stretch of slides, I'm aware of time. So business models are complex, they're messy, but in some ways are really simple. So this is, I suppose, an example operating model of a retailer. I mean, it's pretty simple, really. You buy stuff and you sell things. But there might be loads of sub-processes, which typically aren't mapped. Sometimes they're not even known, or they might be known locally, but not across the organization. The first step to identifying opportunities for analytics overall and generative AI in particular is making sense of this. So moving on to the next slide, what we'll typically do is work with a client to help them identify a complex process. Complexity is important here because if it's not complex, it's probably not worth automating, or at least it's not worth investing in that automation. Then we will work to define the business case or the return on investment. And often this requires a deep understanding of the business's own strategy and objectives, because ideally what we want to do is to identify a high-value complex process, and then to say, well, look, by improving this by a certain amount, by making this faster, making it more accurate, making it more productive, this is the value that we can generate from this. And there is, an art to this in many ways, because you sometimes don't know what the impact will be, but still having that framework is usually very important. And then the third point is there are many different flavors of analytics and AI. It may well be that you need to invest in enablement work. If you don't have a CRM or ERP, AI isn't really going to help you. If you don't have an agreed way of working between your different offices in different parts of the world, AI is not going to help. So in many cases, agreeing that business logic, building the foundational analytics layer is required regardless. But of course, there are a few isolated examples of using generative AI to leapfrog some of these things. But ultimately, you're probably going to run out of those opportunities quite quickly, unless you also invest in the fundamentals of analytics in your business. So moving on, this is an example operating model that's tidied up a bit. If we click through so all of the things come on this slide, we can see here that in a typical retailer, there are a number of high-value complex processes. We've outlined a couple of them here. So route optimization. The route optimization was kind of solved 40 years ago from a computational perspective. But the deployment of this is obviously very difficult for loads of reasons in terms of how retailers work. Another example would be contract analysis. Analyzing contracts and invoicing, accounts receivable or payable is a really difficult challenge because contracts often come in lots of different variants. So this is an example of just quickly tidying up the operating model and using this to identify where there might be high-value complex processes where analytics and AI can provide value. So moving on from this, we can see here that in this simple example, those four use cases fit into kind of different categories here. So generative AI is probably most useful for the bottom right here, so contract analysis. Whereas you may look towards various optimization algorithms to improve route optimization or storage allocation, space allocation in stores, for example. So categorizing these things is really important. And the lower bottom hand there, the off-the-shelf solution, is something that needs to be considered in many cases as well. So moving on from this, and let's go through a quick example, and hopefully we'll have a good 5-10 minutes for discussion. So this is an example of the contract analysis use case, where we've built a number of tools, one of them called ContractCube, which works to extract information from documents. So optical character recognition, OCR, has existed for a very long time. Generative AI can be used to combine different OCR tools and extract information. Next slide. What we then find is that the reality of building generative AI tools is that you want a so-called ensemble of different models, workers or agents focusing on different things. So in the case of contract analysis, a tool that we've built recently used around 15 different models, all working together in harmony, focusing on different elements of this process. So you might, in this particular case, have one model that's pulling out tables. We might have another that's stripping out irrelevant text. We might have another model that's kind of reorientating, kind of rotating tables. So this ensemble of models is the reality of how these tools are built. It's rarely just one model or approach. It's often many working together towards a common goal. So moving on, and the final element of this particular case study is creating invoicing. So in the tool that we've built, there's OCR on the left, then there's ingesting and all these models working together in harmony. And then at the far right, there's the relatively simple bit, which is combining with the billing data, comparing with invoicing, and then reconciling. And this is a very high-level view of service to cash and the way in which generative AI can make this more effective and efficient. So moving on from this then, in summary, there are 5 takeaway points that we wanted to make here. So the first, and many of this is kind of pretty simple, and that's the irony of generative AI. To benefit from this, you've got to focus on the key business skills. It's not really about generative AI. It's about, for example, defining your objectives, prioritizing on high impact use cases, and where possible, kind of checking that this hasn't been built before, there isn't an off-the-shelf solution, and that whatever analytics or AI technology that you're using is most appropriate. So with that, I'll draw to a close the slides, and look forward to any questions that may have been asked. So I can see one question from Tara. So Tara's asked, you've mentioned the use of AI for product innovation. It'd be great to hear about an example of how this is applied. Of course. So generative AI is useful in a number of ways. I think I would say more than half of what we're doing at the moment at QuantSpark is building tools using generative AI, where generative AI is part of it. But as I just showed in the case study there with the service to cash tool, often generative AI is just one component of a broader tool. It might unlock value in terms of orchestrating models, bringing other models together, and maybe understanding information in ways that weren't previously possible. But actually, it often comes down to having a high value use case mapped out in the first place, and then focusing on the why of what you're trying to build. So we focus on building tools using generative AI, but the most important part is the first part, which is making sure that whatever we're building is fixing a problem that matters. And we're building it in a way where you can do it quite quickly, let's say in 3 to 4 weeks. That is possible. What that often depends on is a number of things that have nothing to do with AI. The first is business process mapping, for example, which is widely considered to be pretty boring discipline, but really important. And also thinking through user experience and the user interface. So the irony of this is that to be effective in generative AI deployment, often it's the softer skills that are important in terms of those key success factors. So another question here from Thalia. You've mentioned ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity. Which is your preferred tool and why? So going back to the kind of the personal wave of productivity gains from large language models, I would encourage everyone to try out various tools and see what works for you. And the main advice I'd have is that often this is about getting good at prompting, which takes practice, and making sure that you're providing enough information to large language models for them to be useful. I mean, quite simply, rubbish in, rubbish out. And a large language model may have been trained on everything that's ever been produced digitally in the world, which is quite a lot of information. But actually, for the output to be useful to you, you're going to have to share a lot of context. And going back to the first question I said earlier, if you had 10 really smart graduates, what would you do with them? Well, you'd probably think about where they could be applied usefully, but you'd also want to provide a really comprehensive brief. So that the way in which we think of generative AI is really about delegation. If you can't delegate tasks to a human being, you're probably not going to be able to delegate it to generative AI. So there are various tools. I think we use all of them for different things. They all have various strengths and weaknesses. I'd imagine over time they'll all converge on a similar capability. But just answering your question, Thalia, ChatGPT, I tend to use for more kind of analytical questions about how I might approach a project, how to analyze a particular situation. So I tend to prefer ChatGPT for kind of analytical work. Claude, I prefer to use for language and the production of content. But really, it's just about style. I mean, they're both very good at it. Both can produce code, both can analyze data, both can produce charts. In the case of Claude, it can produce flowcharts from conversations. It can write entire applications for you within minutes. Perplexity relies on many of the other models. Where Perplexity has an edge is in research. So for example, if you wanted to write a bio on someone, or you wanted to do research on a company, go to Perplexity AI, ask it a question, it will search across the internet and then summarize that. So Perplexity AI is just incredible for like market research purposes, and kind of asking the internet about things. And it crucially also provides very clear citations too. I would also say email response automation. So depending on what email system you use, There's Copilot, of course, in the Microsoft infrastructure, which I think is kind of okay, but not particularly useful at the moment. In the Google infrastructure, we've got Gemini. You can deploy Gemini on your emails, and it provides a pretty good kind of summary functionality. But there are also quite a number of startups that are really good at functionality. One that I'm a big fan of is called Fixer AI. So it's Fyxer AI, that hooks into your email system and helps categorize emails. Should you respond to this? Should you follow up with that email? And so on. And it seems like quite a promising startup, actually, using quite simple technology, but deployed very effectively. So next question. You mentioned building trust with your clients. So this is from Vincent. So you mentioned building trust with your clients. How do you drive this topic during negotiations upon receiving security audit questionnaires? More and more corporate clients request guarantees that we do not use Gen AI on their data. So I think if I understand this question, it's about how, where are we using, how are we using proprietary information, and how are we protecting that information? And I think there's really important point to be made here, that training generative AI systems or fine-tuning them is when you're ingesting that information and you're baking it into the model. That's very different from the application of a large language model itself. They're kind of completely separate things. And therefore, the importance of explaining that simply, and hopefully I'm doing a relatively good job of that, is really important. That training a model, you lose access to that information forever, and it could pop up somewhere else. That is a big concern. For the most part, you can use services where they promise not to do that. And obviously that's based on a contract. So you've got to believe that that company won't train its new model on your inputs or your data. ChatGPT Plus, for example, promises it doesn't do that. Obviously, if you don't trust OpenAI, then you might not trust it in that sense. But there is a distinction there. Another thing I would say is that the so-called open source models are increasingly popular. Meta, previously Facebook, of course, has a number of open source models. Llama 3.2 is the most recent, which you can download onto your laptop. You can then turn off the internet. So there are some large language models that you can just completely download, providing your laptop's big enough, and you can run it locally. And there are some very successful examples of using large language models in a national security space, where you can be absolutely confident that no information will leave your environment afterwards. So this so-called miniaturization of large language models and the deployment of that locally is already possible. The only risk with those is you don't necessarily know how the large language model responds. So there is a small possibility that the model could do something unexpected. And could have been corrupted somehow, but very small. So for the most part, I think concerns about security and privacy are valid, and I can completely understand where people are coming from. However, for the most part, there are ways of mitigating that risk. But fundamentally, if you've got information on the cloud, it's no different from the risk associated with information or data being on the cloud anyway. So if you're happy with the cloud, you should probably be happy with using large language models. The risk is probably the same, and it's based on how much you trust your counterparty. I would say we can trust OpenAI, we can trust Anthropic, they run Claude, we can trust others. If the data is so sensitive that it's too risky, then I suggest it possibly shouldn't be on the cloud, maybe shouldn't even be on a laptop that has access to the internet. And there are probably more concerning things around cybersecurity than strictly the large language model element of this. Question from Tim. There are a lot of companies offering AI solutions to help drive business efficiencies and improvements. What differentiates QuantSpark to make it best and right for the supplier to use in this area? So firstly, I would say the solution is never AI, in the sense that this has to be about understanding the business problem and making sure that the analytics technology or approach is appropriate for whatever you're trying to solve. So hopefully the point I've managed to put across here is that you've got to understand your own business, you've got to understand your own processes first, you've got to go through that business case process, you've got to figure out what's it worth, and what's the easiest and quickest way of achieving something. And it could well be that just building an Excel spreadsheet might solve a problem. It could be building a Power BI dashboard that could solve it. So I think we've got to be very thoughtful about not diving into things into the kind of the wrong solution. In terms of what we offer, what we aim to do is provide this end-to-end approach where we'll work with you to understand this strategic problem and then advise you on the right way of going about things. Because it might be there's already an off-the-shelf solution that needs to be configured. It might be that you should hire someone. And we always aim to advise our clients on what the right thing is for them, because it actually might not be building a tool. It could be it already exists and you're just not aware of that capability somewhere. And the final question from Matt: how can leadership encourage teams to embrace generative AI instead of fearing it will replace their roles? I think that's a really good question. And I think it behoves us, those of us in leadership roles, to communicate effectively about generative AI. For the most part, I'd say the only jobs that will be automated or replaced by generative AI are the sort of jobs that the people wouldn't really want. So if you've got kind of a very, if you're taking an email and turning it into an order, generative AI will be able to replace that kind of now, definitely within 6 months. And you'd have to question the job satisfaction of someone doing that, taking an email, turning it into an order. But there will always be a role for people in those sorts of processes to oversee the models and make sure that they're working correctly and then add value to this. So what I would say is that generative AI, when used in a targeted and appropriate way, can improve the efficiency of processes. Humans will always be important to oversee those, but also to add creativity, to add the human touch, to figure out how you can add value. I would say reframe this to say, how can generative AI replace the really mundane and boring parts of your role and empower you to be more effective in engaging with your customers or clients, or using your creativity in some ways? So I know that sounds like quite an abstract way of answering it. But the key to all of this is to focus on the concrete details of what that process is and how we are going to interact with these amazing tools in the future. So with that, I think we're out of time and we're out of questions. Please do feel free to get in touch if any of this has piqued your interest. We'd love to hear about any use cases you have in mind and advise you on what the potential ways forward might be. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.